Welcome to 1189, an online Bible commentary. My name is Tyler Marston, and today we're taking a look at Deuteronomy chapter 14. We're in this section where Moses is repeating a lot of the laws that God has given earlier in the Torah. In the last chapter, we heard how important it was for Israel to worship God and not pagan idols. But here, we'll shift to see what the everyday holiness of the Israelites ought to look like. It'll be accomplished in everything they do, from the kinds of foods they eat to how they give to God and to the poor. But which of these laws, if any of them, apply to us today? I mean, most of us don't keep these same food laws. Yet we are still instructed to live holy lives that honor God. We're instructed to treat those around us with dignity, love, and respect. And by studying how the Israelites were supposed to do it back then, we can discover how we can do it better now. You are the sons of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves, nor shave your forehead for the sake of the dead. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Here we get repetitions of laws from Leviticus 19 and 21, citing that the Israelites should be holy to God. They should be his sons, reflecting his image, and they're to be noticeably different from their pagan neighbors. One way that the people do this is by avoiding Canaanite funeral rituals, which apparently involved cutting yourself or shaving your eyebrows. Now, in contrast, Israel is to be God's people, his own possession. And so just as they should not worship the idols of Canaan, they also should not engage in any of their rituals or ceremonies either. You shall not eat any detestable thing. These are the animals which you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roebuck, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. Any animal that divides the hoof and has the hoof split in two and chews the cud among the animals, that you may eat. Nevertheless, you are not to eat of these among those which chew the cud, or among those that divide the hoof in two: the camel and the rabbit and the shaphan, for though they chew the cud, they do not divide the hoof, they are unclean for you. The pig, because it divides the hoof, but does not chew the cud, it is unclean for you. You shall not eat any of their flesh, nor touch their carcasses. Here we get another list of commands that was repeated from Leviticus 11. The Israelites were instructed to keep a specific diet, one that kept them safe from foodborne illnesses, and one that marked them as set apart as God's people. As far as land animals went, the Jews were only allowed to eat the meat of animals that had split hooves and chewed their own cud. Animals like cattle, sheep, goats, oxen, etc. Of course, it's important to notice too that these were the only animals that were allowed to be sacrificed to God. You're not supposed to give God something that's unclean. And if God is not supposed to consume unclean things, then the Israelites shouldn't do it either. After all, they're supposed to be holy, just like God is holy. As for the unclean animals, Moses gives a few examples of those as well. He forbids Israel from eating them or even touching their carcasses. Now, the big elephant in the room, though, is of course, why do we not keep these dietary restrictions today? Well, that's mostly because of instructions that we find in the New Testament. At a practical level, we're more aware of how foodborne illnesses spread, and so we can avoid them now more effectively. But the main reason is that when God lifted the barrier that separated humanity from him, part of that was lifting cultural barriers that separated Jews from the Gentiles. What this doesn't mean is that we now have full autonomy to eat whatever we want, whenever we want, however much of it we want. Instead, what it means is that we utilize the liberty Christ has given us in order to make sure that his name is glorified and exemplified in every part of the world. And that's no matter the cultural differences that are a little more arbitrary. So with all of that being said, let's get back into these commandments that were given to a specific people, at a specific place, in a specific moment in time. These you may eat of all that are in the water. Anything that has fins and scales you may eat, but anything that does not have fins and scales you shall not eat. It is unclean for you. For the Jews, seafood was clean and available to eat as long as it had fins and scales. That means that most fish was on the menu, except for shellfish and things like catfish. Now, as much as I love catfish and shrimp and crawfish, it kind of makes sense to not want to eat them. All those other fish swam in the open sea, but these are bottom feeders that live in the mud and the dirt. It was likely that they would carry a lot more germs and illnesses, especially in a world before refrigeration. Again, that's an example of how these food laws were meant to keep the people safe. You may eat any clean bird, but these are the ones which you shall not eat: the eagle, and the vulture, and the buzzard, and the red kite, the falcon, and the kite in their kinds, and every raven in its kind, and the ostrich, the owl, the seagull, and the hawk in their kinds, the little owl and the great owl, the white owl, the pelican, the carrion vulture, the cormorant, the stork and the heron in their kinds, and the hoopoe and the bat. And all the teeming life with wings are unclean to you. They shall not be eaten. You may eat any clean bird. And of course, there were also restrictions on what kinds of birds the Jews could eat. Moses says that all the birds are clean and able to eat, except for those on a specific list. And if you notice, most of those are birds of prey. And so this brings about another point about these food laws and cleanliness laws. They were also put in place to limit the Jews to exposure to death and symbols of death. This is why ceremonial washings were so important. And you couldn't touch a corpse or a grave without afterwards being purified. Of course, there's a hygienic level to it, but there's also a symbolic and spiritual level to it too. And so animals and birds that were associated with digging around and eating corpses, they were forbidden to be eaten themselves. Because the physical reality and the spiritual reality was that you didn't want that death spreading to you. It reflects Israel's purpose of bringing God's life to the rest of the world. You shall not eat anything which dies of itself. You may give it to the alien who is in your town, so that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Now, any animal that had died on its own, whether it was clean or not, was not to be eaten. And again, that's because it was associated with death and had the very real possibility of spreading plagues. But these animals you were allowed to sell to foreigners. And that's because the dietary restrictions were also meant to mark Israel out as separate from all the other nations. And it's here that we also get a very infamous law that has puzzled scholars for centuries. You're not supposed to eat the meat of a young goat that has been boiled in the milk of its mother. There were also similar commands given in Exodus 23 and 34. Now, normally these verses are only ever brought up to talk about how weird or foreign the biblical laws are. But if you really read through the first 5 books of the Bible, I think this is the exception that proves the rule. Most of the commands in the Bible are about loving and serving God, about setting yourself apart for His purposes, and emulating His attributes in your life and the relationships you make in your community. There's no other goal, even for strange laws like the ones given here. In his commentary, the ancient Jewish scholar Philo wrote about this specific commandment. He wrote that it would be grossly improper to eat a young goat that had been boiled in its mother's milk, in the one thing that used to keep this animal alive. As with many of the other commands, it would be too celebratory of death and violence. Now, another very important thing to note is that in all 3 of the places where this commandment appears, it's in conjunction with instructions about Jewish gatherings and feasts. And so this has led many scholars to believe that maybe this restriction has something to do with a pagan fertility ritual, showing how those Canaanite ceremonies should not be celebrated in conjunction with the holidays that God has commanded. Speaking of which, you shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field every year. You shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God, at the place where He chooses to establish His name, the tithe of your grain, your new wine, your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and your flock, so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. Moses reminds the people that they should tithe, that is, sacrifice to God 10% of the animals and crops that they were able to produce in that year. And this instruction is repeated from Leviticus 27. Now, oftentimes, talks of sacrificing animals and grain sound strange and foreign to us. But notice how God instructs all the people to eat this offering together with Him at the place where He chooses to establish His name. What this means is that when you sacrifice your time and money to bring something to the church potluck, you're almost kind of doing something similar. Giving to God and giving to God's people is important for making our relationship to God tangible and evident. It shows that we trust God to provide for us with whatever is left over after we give to Him. If the distance is so great for you that you are not able to bring the tithe, since the place where the Lord your God chooses to set His name is too far away from you when the Lord your God blesses you, then you shall exchange it for money, and bind the money in your hand, and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses. You may spend the money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen, or sheep, or wine, or strong drink, or whatever your heart desires, and there you shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God, and rejoice, you and your household. Now, of course, God is not a cosmic dictator. As far as the tithe goes, concession is made for Jews who are going to end up living in Galilee, who are not going to be able to drive a tenth of their cattle all the way to Jerusalem. For people in that circumstance, they were actually to sell their tithe and bring the money to Jerusalem, and there buy whatever their contribution was going to be. Moses even says that the people should bind the money in their hand so that they wouldn't be tempted to spend it on the way. I think we should similarly be on the lookout for greed in our own lives, which can creep up from anywhere, out of all kinds of situations. Whatever we've promised to give, we should give, whether that's to God, or to the church, or to a ministry, or to a person in need. Also, you shall not neglect the Levite who is in your town, for he has no portion or inheritance among you. At the end of every 3rd year, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in that year, and shall deposit it in your town. The Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance among you, and the alien, the orphan, and the widow who are in your town, shall come and eat and be satisfied, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. Finally, there's a concession that's also made for the Levites, which is repeated from Numbers 18. They are to be priests and spiritual leaders in their communities, so they're not going to have one piece of land altogether that will be theirs as a tribe to inherit. So God has promised that they will all receive a portion of the tithe from every other tribe in Israel. Moses says that every 3 years, the tithe will go to the Levites. But that large deposit is also going to benefit the poor, the widows, the orphans, the immigrants, and others who have no way to provide for themselves. God has made promises to the Levites. He has made promises to the poor in Israel, and He has promised to look after them and provide them. And the way that's going to get done is through the rest of Israel obeying these laws, being generous, giving to them, and not overlooking them. This same dynamic is true for us today. We all need to make sure that the needy around us, in our communities, especially in our church communities, have no lack for anything. While many may think that these rules for dietary restrictions and tithing are irrelevant for Christians today, we actually see a lot of truth here in this chapter. We need to honor God with what we're eating. That is, what we're putting into our bodies and running them off of. We need to be holy. We need to be set apart in order to be used for God's purposes. And we also need to give back out of what God has blessed us with, whether that's money or time or talent or resources. And it needs to be spent in the service of our churches and the poor and the vulnerable that are in our communities. And this is how, even today, through Jesus, we are able to continue to keep God's law and stay in a covenant with Him, even if the specificities of the time and the culture change the details a little bit. Thanks for watching 1189. I hope that you have a good day, and God bless.